And WPFW presents a tribute to saxophonist Ron Holloway and the unveiling of the Ron Holloway mural. The event happens Saturday, September 14th at 4 p.m. across the street from the historic Howard Theater. It is free and open to the public. This is your opportunity to honor one of DC's great musicians and enjoy live music. WPFW, your station for jazz and justice, serving the collective need and imagination of the community.
What's at stake? I am the Reverend Graylin Scott Hagler, your host every second Wednesday of the month. Our executive producer is Verna Avery Brown, and Chris B.D. is our engineer this morning with us here in the studio. I want to welcome you back. I've taken a little bit of a summer hiatus, but I am back and looking forward to some robust subject matter that we will deal with. We're here this morning on this 18th anniversary of 9/11, which has led to endless wars, and the longest war in U.S. history, and an obsession over terrorism and who are terrorists, and this obsession over the other, and the sort of the magnification of xenophobia, while we have ignored the root causes of war and conflict in the world. And so today we're going to have a little bit of a discussion around the aftermath of 9/11 and the effects that it has produced for the culture. And also, we're going to start out that discussion this morning with someone who I have known and has a book out called Shut It Down. Lisa, good morning. Are you on the air with us?
Yes, I am. Good morning, Graylin.
Good morning, Lisa. It's good to hear your voice. And Danny Sickwall sends her love to you. And she wanted to make sure I let you know that. Now, Lisa has shut down the CIA. She has occupied Wall Street. She's disrupted the World Trade Organization and stood her ground in Tahrir Square. She has walked in solidarity with tribal leaders at Standing Rock and defended communities in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. Described by Mother Jones as the nation's best-known protest consultant, Fithian has been involved in nearly every major protest event for the past 4 decades. She is living proof that the best way to radically and rapidly transform the ills of our society is through nonviolent direct action grounded in strong beliefs, creativity, and sheer unwavering courage. Her book, her new memoir, filled with instruction, inspiration, and no shortage of wisdom, argues that civil disobedience is much more than an act of resistance. It's a spiritual pursuit that allows us to reclaim our humanity and protect what we love. As the struggle for social justice continues in this era and beyond, Shut It Down, that's the name of the book, is a timely and compelling contribution to the literature of dissent and an inspirational handbook for the next generation of activists fighting for change now. That's an introduction to Lisa this morning. And Lisa, I want you to start out by doing some reflection, particularly with your history of engagement, your history of resistance. Where are we in the aftermath, 18 years later, of 9/11?
Well, we have not made the advances that many of us would have hoped in terms of exercising the power of the people of the world, of this planet, who rose up in advance of the war in 9/11, which was the war that, the global war on terror that was the outcome of the attacks on the World Trade Center. And we said no to war back then. Over 11 million people. We were called the third superpower, big superpower. But those lessons were not heeded. And we continue to stay at war. I mean, we still have troops in Afghanistan. This administration is continuing to, raise the threat of war. We have continued to see the military-industrial complex continue to grow. The military still controls the vast majority of our resources and is the greatest emitter of carbon that's destroying the planet. So we have not learned the lessons and are still living with the legacy of that. So yes. I wish I could say it was in a better place, but it's not right now.
Well, one of the things that get me, and I think that this is something that we should explore a little bit, is that we have a lack of connection in this country. We pull things and look at things in a context without the connections that has led to that context. If you know what I mean. It's like, how can you go and basically rob resources from people around the world? How can you basically exploit cultures over those resources, minerals and fossil fuel and all those other types of things, and basically have a negative impact on the society, and then turn around and be surprised when people do not have an affectionate spirit towards you. And I think that you've been out there for pretty much 4 decades doing your work and standing up. But I need to ask the question, what do you see as the connections, the theme that runs through all of these things that we're facing right now in our world, and particularly right now in the U.S. Culture?
Well, for me, the thing that ties it all together is this notion of supremacy, that some people are superior to others. And quite frankly, it goes back, some say it goes back to the founding of civilization, when humans believed that they were separate from nature and had the ability to control nature. But if you look at the founding of this country, this land of this United States, it was rooted in this settler colonialism and this idea that anything there was ours for the taking, this idea of white supremacy, male supremacy, and quite frankly, wealth supremacy. And so these notions that those of us that are white are smarter, more entitled, has led to a country that has, engaged in massive genocide, the enslavement of black people, the colonization of people's lands, taking resources, and those things continue today because they are a set of beliefs that we're all socialized into. And so we, unless we are willing to do the hard work of facing that reality of these belief systems and the values that come out of them, we continue to perpetuate those systems today. Which is one of the reasons why in my work over these years, Grayland, I continue to do my own personal work around white supremacy and how that can work through me. And from that, also understanding the importance of healing the trauma that is created by those belief systems, not only to me, but particularly to black and brown and indigenous bodies in this country that live every day with their life on their line. So it's a sickness. It continues, and the economic system rooted in this idea that we need to create profit off of things, and that the commodification of life to be bought and sold and transformed into junk that we buy to feel like we're happy. All of these things are what I believe continue to create this culture of death. But this is really where my work is right now, and I'm hoping that our movement can learn these histories and enact a whole new way of being in relationship and in the cultures that we're building.
One of the things is that there's always issues, and you've been engaged in many of the most relevant issues of our time. And we do the work, and yet somehow, the victories are few and far between. How do we continue to keep our spirit alive to do the work, and is it worth it?
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's totally worth it. It's why I keep doing this work, because it actually keeps me alive. I believe that this work is like building that culture of life. And when I go out in the streets with people and we come together, collectively to try and make a change, you can see people come to life again. When people begin to get a sense of their power, that they can, in fact, make a difference and make a change, it's like you never go back. It's like once you're out of that box, you can't go back. And so, I also think that we have to keep, how we define victory and success. Sometimes we have big victories, and we may not see them in the moment of our struggle. And a lot of times we don't win a particular fight or legislative objective or struggle. But I often look at the victory as in, are we more connected as people? Have we built the relationships that will allow us to come back again over time for the next struggle? Are we making our lives, small improvements in people's lives that allow us to be a little bit easier, a little bit more secure? So that human connection, those relationships, building our collective power community, for me, that is a victory, and that's an essential part of everything that we achieve when we do our organizing in a good way.
Excellent, excellent. Now, one of the things I want to, it's something I've been thinking about lately, is that what steps onto the stage, particularly over indigenous cultures, whether they're here in the North America, Central America, South America, or Africa, or even in places like Australia, New Zealand, all around the world, is that what happens is that folks step out of Europe with this concept, and I don't know where it came from or why it was so obsessive, but this concept of private property, and that they began to apply private property and private property rights and to create legal structure to basically confirm and protect private property. And that becomes the basis of the exploitation of all this stuff that we have seen in the world, the exploitation of the land, the exploitation of the water, the exploitation of peoples and cultures. How do we go about undoing that concept, or at least re-examining that concept so that it is more palatable and, in a sense, can empower people rather than destroy people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is really a root connection, our relationship to the land. I mean, there are, there are glimmers of things happening. In the global north, there's the emergence of a movement around the commons, the recognition that the land is a collective resource, that no one can own it. In this country, as the indigenous movements have been rising, particularly after Standing Rock, and there's a greater understanding of how this land was stolen, there are moments and places where people are realizing we need to give that land back to the original stewards of that land. I think one of the discussions I know I've been having more and more in this political work is that this idea of violence often comes up as a way to, criminalize our movements and divide our movements. When I think that this notion of private property is a prime example of an extreme form of violence that is being enacted on the planet, that we think that we can own it, and it's the basis of tremendous deforestation that's happening, the development of corporate buildings. Right? I believe it's a violence enacted on the land, and we need to change that relationship and understand that, this land is it's a resource of abundance. It's here for all of us, and if we tend it and are a good relationship with it, it will continue to support all the species on this planet. But at the rate we're going of destroying it, the entire, we know we're in the sixth great extinction, and we know that the continuation of humanity on this planet is, quite frankly, in question. So I think that that's an important part of the conversation about what is our relationship to this land, and I think it's also a reason for more and more people to understand and support indigenous nations and communities that are struggling to protect the land. So I wish I had a better answer for you on that, Braylon, about what to do about this stuff, but it's a change in values, it's a change in practices, and, there are glimmers of hope. There are much more urban gardens coming up and understanding of organics and moving away from monocultures, but I still think that we have not sort of turned the corner on recognizing that the earth is alive, we are connected to it, we are interdependent, and that our survival is directly connected to the survival of the land and the planet itself.
And, it's one of the things that, particularly, my background as a preacher, this whole idea becomes an idolatry. The idolatry that I got to be like God. I got to control all of the land and the people in the land, and basically the devil with coexistence, because it's all about me, myself, and I. There's a total self-centeredness, egotism, self-centeredness to the way basically oppressive forces approach other people and cultures. And why don't you tell us, Lisa, what you're working on right now, and what do you see as the need to work on?
I believe there's, the two greatest threats, I believe, today are the rise of fascism and the climate emergency that we are facing. And they're connected. So part of my work is always about building those connections between movements. But I recently this year started working with Extinction Rebellion, which is this global movement emerging to try and tackle the climate emergency by engaging in mass campaigns of civil disobedience and social disruption for the purpose of forcing those in power to make a radical change and a restructuring of the economy as it currently is, and to recognize that people across this planet have to be a part of that process of this just transition so that there's truly equity in this process. So that's what I've been doing. It's a new movement that's emerging. We have been building relationships with indigenous organizers across this country, and part of this education is recognizing that the climate emergency is one of the primary reasons why we've seen these migrations across the world and coming to the U.S., and that there's an intersection here. And so as we look at babies being imprisoned on the borders and ICE raids in people's communities, and then the actual rise of the white supremacists who are willing to do harm, this is one of the things, it's like those of us that are white all enact white supremacy, but there are some whose willingness to really do harm consciously it is terrifying for many communities today. So as I go forward in my work, building on these lessons of undoing the systems of oppression, being willing to engage in mass nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience, it's also this notion of solidarity. We are in an era where we can no longer afford to be siloed in our different movements, but look at where we can come together to protect one another, to turn out in the streets together. Because if you bring all the movements together and the people that are connected to those movements and just ordinary working people, because there are millions of people who understand what's happening right now is wrong, and that their livelihood and way of life is in danger, but many just don't know what to do about it. So we've got to work in a way that's inviting everyone to become a part of this, that cares for humanity, and creates opportunities for them to, again, exercise their power, get a little bit of a taste of their own power and agency so they can continue to do the organizing that needs to be done to turn all this stuff around.
What's the name of your book again?
It's Shut It Down.
Shut It Down.
Stories from a fierce-loving resistance. And, you can find out about the events coming up. I'm traveling around the country at shutitdownnow.org because, I'm on a mission, Graylin, to, help agitate and ferment and get more and more people activated and escalating their resistance. For me, the time is now. What are we waiting for?
Where can people get the book?
They can buy it at independent news stores. Actually, on that website, shutitdownnow.org, there's a place where you can buy them. But they're out in bookstores across the country right now, a lot of independent bookstores. Barnes & Noble is carrying it. And you can get it online at Powell. And then you can also get it online at the Evil Amazon.
All
but
right.
I always say to people, you can, infiltrating. And if you like this book, I'd appreciate you going and reviewing it on Goodreads or Amazon. You don't have to buy it there, but you could review it there, because we are trying to infiltrate into the mainstream. And we need to do this together. I can't do this alone. I need your help.
Lisa Fithian, we're talking to about her memoir, Shut It Down. You're listening to WPFW FM 89.3. I'm Reverend Graylin Scott Hagler, host every second Wednesday of the month on What's at Stake. I usually make a call for folks to call in. And if you do want to call in, we have a few more minutes with Lisa. You can phone us at 202-588-0893. That's 202-588-0893. Now, Lisa, even before I put that call out, somebody took the initiative and called in. Good morning, caller. How are you?
I'm doing well, and good morning to you and your guest, to Lisa. Reverend Hagler, you talked about this whole idea of the idolatry, but I have to, with all due respect, say it started really with the whole Abrahamic tradition in terms of a chosen people. There's a documentary on Netflix called The Family, and it's all about the Christian, the whole evangelical thing. And they talk about this covenant that, Jesus had, that God had with the people, the chosen ones. And that's really the height of idolatry, I think, because all of creation, was manifested by the divine, and you had cultures all over the planet that had no idea about who Jesus was, and yet through the papal bull of the doctrine of discovery, they were basically killed. Genocide was visited upon them. So I think it really starts with that whole notion of a chosen people. I know that has huge implications in terms of Israel and Jews and all of that, but
let me sort of carry on that discussion with you just a second, because I think that one of the things that is important to view is that in just about every religious document, no matter what culture or history it comes from, people always thought of themselves of having a special relationship with the divine, the holy. That has always been in existence. What has happened in this regard is we've taken a particular set of sacred words and have elevated it to this place because it basically has affirmed kings, queens, right? It is deified. I mean, even Caesar deified himself. And in order to have control over the population and therefore, quote unquote, to have rights over land, over people, over cultures, over history, all of those types of things. So to a great degree, you're correct. But I just wouldn't lay it at the Abrahamic traditions because I think it goes beyond there.
Well, I mean, given that tradition is sort of we're so-called Christian nation, or at least that's what they're trying to impose upon us way, right?
Yep.
And it's from that point of view, and given the fact that it's the small percentage of the Abrahamic tradition controlling the world. Let's be real about all
I'm
that.
going to ask for Lisa to jump in here.
Yeah,
Lisa,
let me get. I watched The Family as well, and I was like, man, we need to go shut down that prayer breakfast because I understood how they were taking a belief system and abusing it is a way to continue to have political influence and economic influence. And I think that's what we need to understand. I never consider myself a religious person, but I do consider myself a spiritual person.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that we have to understand is that, in every system there is this notion of supremacy that runs through, and it's not just in a religious system. It's in every system, and it's interconnected. And that's where the problem is, because when people buy into that, it automatically sets up what I call an abuse of power.
I would have to challenge that
Carl, I want to thank you. We need to move on. Yeah. But let me say a couple things, because one thing is that, and I think you're absolutely right, Lisa. If I'm right, and only me and my kind are right, and everybody else is wrong, that is automatically a paradigm of supremacy. And then if I got the tools of power with which to carry out my will, then it becomes an oppressive, supremacy. And so what we got to deal with is really, and it comes down to that idea that I have to control it, I have to define it. It's an I type of equation that we need to move beyond, because I think that when you dealt with folks in indigenous communities, they saw the land and the elements and the minerals as being that which the Creator had supplied. It didn't belong to any oil company. It didn't belong to any mining company. It was provided. Am I right in that?
Absolutely. And it's interesting, Graylin. One of the things in my lifetime as well is, like, I used to think there was something wrong with me, but the more I learned about white supremacy and how it manifests, that this notion that there's only one way and it's my way and that's the right way and that I'm perfect and all these things that sort of get into how we see things, those of us that have white privilege across this planet, it's that sickness, and it's that it's centering of us as the individual as opposed to that collective, and understanding also, as you said, from indigenous wisdom, that all of the, everything is alive, quite frankly, and everything is part of a whole. So that's definitely where I come from, So yeah, and it's when we're in that space of understanding that interconnection, it's a space of humility, a space of respect, a space of appreciation and gratitude, and that's really where I'm working to build a culture where we can understand that we've all been messed up, right? And there's a tremendous healing. And if we start enacting these other ways of being in relationship today, I think that we have some hope of building something better for not only in our lifetime, but for the people that come after us.
Thank you, Lisa. And it was good to have you here this morning. Give us the name of the book again.
Shut It Down.
Shut
Stories
It Down.
From a Fierce Loving Resistance.
And it can be found where?
Well, you can go to my website, shutitdownnow.org, and there's a whole list of places you can buy the book. And I appreciate your support on that.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. It's good to have you here. We're going to take a quick break. We got a call on the line, and we're going to come to that caller shortly, but not right now, because we're going to take a short break and hear from our community calendar. And then when we come back, we will be joined by Dr. Maha Hilal, who is the co-director of Justice for Muslims Collective, our community calendar.
Hi, I'm Violeta Curiel, and this is your WPFW Social Justice Calendar for the Washington metro area. Monday, September 9th, join the DC Venezuela Action Network for the presentation. Let's get straight about the U.S. role in Venezuela. Code Pink's Terry Mattson, who just returned from Venezuela, will speak on the dangerous pose to Venezuelan citizens as the U.S. economic war widens, 7 p.m. at West End Public Library, 2301 L Street, Northwest, D.C. For more information, call 202-277-8252. Tuesday, September 10th, David Ranney discusses his book, Living and Dying on the Factory Floor, which includes discussions of the nature of work, racism, race, and class, the use of immigration policy for social control, and our ability to create a just society. 4 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. at the Institute for Policy Studies, 1301 Connecticut Avenue, Northwest, on the 6th floor. For more information, go online to ips-dc.org/events or call 202-787-5229. Wednesday, September 11th, the Democracy Collaborative's Ted Howard and Marjorie Kelly will discuss their newly released book, The Making of a Democratic Economy, and host a Q&A around building prosperity for the many and not the few. 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. at Busboys and Poets, 2021 14th Street Northwest. For more information, visit the Democracy Collaborative's Facebook page or go to ademocraticeconomy.org. Sunday, September 15th, is the inaugural meeting of the DC Area Radical Book Club discussing Volume 1 of Mumia Abu-Jamal and Stephen Victoria's Murder Incorporated, Dreaming of Empire, 2:30 p.m. at the Petworth Library in the meeting room, 4200 Kansas Avenue, Northwest DC, near the Georgia Avenue Petworth Metro Station on the Green Line. For more information, call 202-365-7297 or send email to tporourke@gmail.com. That's tporourke@gmail.com. Tuesday, September 24th, Nefa Freeman and Vanessa Beck with the Black Alliance for Peace will discuss lessons for the struggle for liberation in Venezuela and what it means for the struggle for Black liberation here. 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. at Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ, 5301 North Capitol Street, Northeast, Washington, D.C. For more information, call 202-723-5300 or visit the Facebook page of Plymouth Board of Social Action. For an online listing of these events, or if you'd like your social justice event included in the social justice calendar, visit the webpage ips-dc.org/social justice calendar, where you will find submission guidelines. The Social Justice Calendar is a public service brought to you by the Institute for Policy Studies in partnership with WPFW, your station for just and justice.
And good morning again. You're listening to WPFW 89.3 FM. This is What's at Stake, and I'm your host every second Wednesday of the month. I'm Reverend Graylin Scott Hagler, and here we are on this day, this anniversary of September the 11th, and we're going to be joined by Dr. Maha Hilal, who is the co-director of the Justice for Muslims Collective. Dr. Maha, you're here?
Yes, I'm here.
Well, it's good to hear your voice this morning. And your other co-director is Darashan Raja. I know I'm messing all these names up. forgive me, right? Before I begin, I want to go to a caller who's been waiting on the line just to hear the caller's comment, and then we'll get into what we need to get into. Caller, you there? Good morning.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for your great show. I've read several books about 9/11, and it's overwhelming evidence that the government is lying. The official government story is a lie. The facts about 9/11 is that 3 buildings collapsed on 9/11. And only 2 of them were hit by airplanes. And the speed of their collapse, it collapsed as quickly as if you dropped an object from the height to the bottom. And that indicates that explosives were used.
Well, thank you.
And if it was only an airplane which hit the building, there'd be a hole in the building. The buildings would not have totally collapsed. And so much aspects of the government story are a lie about hijackers. They were
Thank you for your comments, and I appreciate it. And one of the things is that there's always the conspiracies around things that happen that are very dramatic and very dramatic. But one thing I can clearly say is that I don't believe everything that the government has to report around 9/11 in the first place. But also, I don't believe that there is a denial of what has taken place in terms of September the 11th. But I do know this. I do know that the aftermath of September the 11th caused a lot of people to be in the crosshairs of people's anger and people's misplaced and misdirected hostility towards the world. And the Muslim community was one of those places where that hostility manifested itself. In fact, people were attacked because they were thought to be Muslim when some of them were Sikhs and other movements. And so, Dr. Maha, thank you so much for being here and on this anniversary, 18th anniversary of September 11th, and tell us a little bit about what you're working on and why you're working on it.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Reverend Hagler, for having me on the show. So today we have a big event in the evening, and the event entails the launch of a visual timeline of the War on Terror. And the point of the timeline is to really understand the totality of the violence that has been directed at Muslims and to connect seemingly disparate policies under the guise of the War on Terror that have been treated as sort of, disconnected, or that there isn't a thread of Islamophobia that's sort of rooted in the entire apparatus of the War on Terror. So we have posters for every year since 2001 that really show the range of ways Muslims have been targeted, whether it's surveillance, whether it's detention, whether it's an extrajudicial assassination. And through the poster series, we're hoping that people will leave with, A, a better understanding of, what the War on Terror has involved, and B, how deeply rooted Islamophobia has been throughout.
Amen. Where's that event and what time? Repeat that for us.
Yes, so the event will take place tonight at True Reformer Building, which is 1200 U Street Northwest. And the event is from 5 to 8. I will be giving a short keynote presentation, and we will also have a session on cultural organizing by a group called The Sanctuaries, who helped us in partnership to bring the timeline to fruition.
Great. Thank you, Doctor. And one of the things I want to point out, because even as we talk about this idea of the war on terrorism, this whole word terrorism is a tricky word in the first place, because it is a way in which people target and malign a particular population. And it is not new. It has existed. But it's always interesting that you can talk about folks being terrorists, but ignore your own collective terrorism as a country. And as, when you look back at the, not only the establishment of the U.S., but the U.S. in terms of its foreign policy, for many, that has been an act of terrorism, even though the United States government would never talk about it as their own terrorism perpetrated against the population out there. And so it's a matter of where you look at this from, the perspective that you have. And in a sense, we're also realizing, I think the Muslim community really began to understand in the aftermath of 9/11 what it meant to be other in the United States of America. And right. in many ways to join in a collective way with the black community who has always been other since we arrived 400 years ago in the British colonies. And so in a sense, we have a understanding that comes out of this way that America has related to us.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously the U.S.'s state violence goes back for hundreds of years, obviously, with the enslavement of African Americans and the genocide of indigenous folks in the United States. And it hasn't even been limited to people that live in the United States. The United States has been obviously a major purveyor of violence in countries abroad. And I think the interesting thing about 9/11 is how squarely the United States roots itself in the idea of victimhood. And I think that sense of victimhood sort of justifies everything else that it does. Mm-hmm. So, for example, when President Bush gave a speech on September 20th, which was 9 days after, September 20th, 2001, 9 days after the 9/11 attacks, he said that Americans have known surprise attacks, but never before on thousands of civilians. All of this was brought upon us in a single day, and night fell on a different world, a world where freedom itself is under attack. So in other words, what happened to the United States has to be centered in the entire world, right? Like the U.S.'s victimhood is the most important thing that the world needs to focus on.
And also, Dr. Hilal, there's this word that keeps getting thrown around, and you still hear it, this idea of freedom, that somehow right. America represents freedom, which means that there's something unique and special about the U.S. And if you notice, nobody will ever try to define what that freedom is. You send soldiers right. off and they're fighting for our freedoms. I'm not sure what that is, that when they go off and fight for freedoms, or Bush, as he said on that day, they hate us because of our freedoms. In a sense, it became a nice buzzword that basically, feeds the anger of the American population who don't even know, therefore, what that word means or what they're fighting for.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think that the goal of using such abstract concepts to define, the reason for the 9/11 attacks is, number one, to kind of get some sort of unity from countries that also have the concept or the perception that they have freedom in their countries. And it also, to me, highlights, freedom for who? And who does that actually apply to in the United States, right? I mean, there might be freedom for some people, but it's, certainly not people of color, right? So I think that they also, in the beginning and even until now, right? Well, maybe not as much now, but the rhetoric that, especially that President Bush used, was very much about this false sense of unity in the, American community. And obviously that's just not true, right? And even when he would say we, it's like, who is the we, right? Is the we all of Americans? Probably not, because all of Americans, don't get the same rights that other Americans get. So I think it's very interesting, especially, of course, when we're talking about Muslims.
I remember a few days later after the September the 11th event, I was on the telephone talking to my insurance company over something. And all of a sudden, the woman on the other end of the line says, can you please hold a minute? And so I'm holding, and all of a sudden I hear all these voices back in whatever boiler room I was talking to, singing "God Bless America," right? And they were singing at the top of their lungs, and it was like, oh my God. But that's a part of this whole delusion that gets created to build the kind of unity over empty phrases, over things that don't mean anything, and also to forget about the terrorism and the violence that you have rained down for hundreds of years on the world. One of the things that, if you remember this, Dr. Maha, this whole idea of the white man's burden, remember that? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right? Was that, the white man's burden, he was saddled with the responsibility of all the rest of these people of color because they would starve to death if it wasn't for the white man providing institution, infrastructure, and survival. And it's the kind of arrogance that goes forth that allows folks somehow to feel, even in their evil, that they're doing something good.
Yeah, absolutely. That's how that's at the root of how the U.S. justifies the violence that it creates and perpetuates, right? That this country has some sort of moral superiority, and things like freedom are principles that we need to fight for, and that, therefore, if we need to fight for it and we are morally superior, then any act of violence that is committed by the United States is therefore justified and legitimate. And I think you see that all the time. And the other thing is, when you're talking about these more abstract concepts, part of that is to extend the timeline on when this war on terror is going to end, right? Because there's never going to be, I would say reasonably, there's never really going to be an end to terrorism because there's always going to be, state violence. And so when will this war end? And again, that's the goal of using abstract terms, is to prolong the war on terror and other wars in the past, right? But in this particular context, it's, freedom. Okay, so we're always going to be,
yes,
free according to the United States. So, people are always going to attack us for our freedom, right? It's about our freedom. Yeah. And so I think, the timeline here is very important because there actually is no timeline. And, I understand that under the Obama administration, he sort of moved away from using the phrase war on terror, which to me was a meaningless change because the policies and laws remained the same and actually got worse in some cases. So to me, it's not really a matter of what is it called? It's a matter of when is this going to end?
Mm-hmm. And you're listening to WPFW 89.3 FM. I'm Reverend Graylin Hagler. We're talking with Dr. Maha Hilal, who is the co-director of Justice for Muslims Collective. Did I pronounce your name close to right at that time?
Yeah.
Okay. If you want to get in on the discussion, we invite you to join us in the discussion on 202-588-0893. 202-588-0893. We're talking about September the 11th and this so-called war on terrorism and all of the idea of keeping somebody as other. Join us in the discussion this morning. As we sit here and we ponder where we are right now, some 18 years later now, it was years ago. It was shortly after that that Imam Mahdi Bray was removed from an airplane because of and other Muslims were removed from airplanes all over the country for either praying or looking strange. You remember that whole rash of people just sort of removing people from planes, and Mahdi said, I get stopped for driving while black, and I get thrown off the plane for flying while Muslim. And it was sort of really characterize the kind of dynamic that was going on and is going on in this country, because that has not stopped. Now people want you to believe that somehow we've become better in these 18 years as a society. Have we not become better, or is it still about the same, or has manifested itself in some very subtle and dangerous ways?
I don't think we've become better at all. I think the only thing we're better at is trying to disguise state violence, and trying to disguise, the brutality of the United States. And, that goes along with how the U.S. often talks about global conflict, and especially the conflict that it perpetuates. And it's always sort of in a vacuum, right? There's never any analysis of the root causes of conflict. So when we're talking about, for example, immigration from countries around the world. There's never any analysis as to why that would happen. There's no analysis of why are there people that are forming groups such as ISIS to, challenge the United States. And many believe, including myself, that, the conditions that the U.S. created in Iraq are what led to the creation of ISIS. But again, there's never any examination of the root causes of the violence. And so therefore, the United States is not only able to continue to claim its moral legitimacy, it feeds information to the public that is a very limited narrative, and subsequently, there's no desire from the public to actually challenge what's happening because they really don't understand. And that's very clear when, I listen to a lot of speeches by President Bush, Obama, and Trump for the research and work.
I feel sorry for you. Go ahead. Having to listen to all those speeches.
But it's interesting, actually, for today's events because, with the poster series, we're talking about things like torture, detention, death. And when you hear the speeches and they talk about, what countries are civilized, obviously that's the United States. Bush talks about the Americans being a decent people. And so it's very interesting, this contradiction, right? Especially when you have a visual. So you're listening to, how speeches that claim this moral superiority, and at the same time, and we're going to play speeches, this is why I mention it, in the background for the exhibit. So you're hearing all this, positive rhetoric about who the United States, what the United States is, who it is, how do we define ourselves, and then you're looking at someone being tortured.
You're listening to Dr. Maha Hilal, who is the co-director of the Justice for Muslims Collective, who's talking about the event that they're having this evening at 5. Is that correct?
Yes.
At the True Reformer building on U Street, and the address is 1200 U Street?
Yes.
Right.
Northwest.
So we'll be there. We have a couple callers. Hopefully you'll want to take a couple callers and interact with them. Sure. Caller, good morning. You're on the air.
Good morning.
How you doing?
My name is Brian from District Heights.
Mm-hmm. And
I can't pronounce your guest name, but you and your guest hit the nail right on the head. It's funny that this is your topic this morning because I was just saying to my fiance, she's watching TV and down TV was saying something, portraying. First of all, no the people that died that day, but just like it was stated, the United States is
You're breaking up a little this morning, caller. You're breaking up a little.
Like I said, no disrespect to people that perished that day.
Yes.
But, that's all I got to say. You and your guest hit the nail right on the head.
Well, thank you for your perspective. Thank you so much.
All right, you're welcome.
Dr. Maha, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think, people often perceive the work that we do or the pushbacks that we make as somehow, minimization of the people that were killed on 9/11, and that's not what we're doing, nor is it what we're trying to do. We get sad if any innocent person is a victim to, non-state actors or state actors. And so, we take that seriously. At the same time, there are very few discussions that actually center the ways that Muslims have been impacted throughout the course of the war on terror. Even today, right, there's a couple of trending hashtags, including Never Forget. And we know that doesn't mean Muslims, right? It doesn't mean never forget what happened to Muslims as a result of the 9/11 attack.
Well, a perfect example is the poster that showed up in West Virginia of Representative Omar,
mm-hmm.
right, standing in front with the picture, sort of put her there in front of the World Trade Center, right?
Yeah, right.
Like, somehow saying that she was there.
Right. They always malign her, so she's
right. they're saying because, but you can't lose sight of this. Here you have a woman that is obviously Muslim,
right?
Dresses like a Muslim, right?
Right.
And carries herself with dignity, I must add, and with character and with integrity. Does not back down from a fight. And they cannot stand that kind of image being portrayed as an image that is strong, that is perceptive, that is not afraid of standing up to these elements in the culture and saying what's wrong is wrong and what's right is right.
Right. I mean, I think that there is a lot of scrutiny on Ilhan Omar as well as, Rashida Tlaib.
Yes.
And yes, they are. It is very much about we don't actually want you to claim your rights. We don't actually see you as, human beings because of the ways that Muslims have been so dehumanized throughout the course of the war on terror. And obviously, since the founding of this country and when enslaved Muslims were brought here. And so I think that continues to be a problem. And I also think that the Muslim community has contributed to this problem. And specifically in the way that, we sometimes try to assimilate and get that, proverbial seat at the table.
Sure.
And what that often involves is compromising our rights in order to get that seat at the table. And so I think that we sometimes as Muslims, I'm not going to include myself in this because I reject that approach. But, when we're willing to compromise our own rights, then that sends a message to the state
sure.
that they can also compromise our rights.
That's right.
That keeps happening time and time again. And, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib have obviously taken a strong stance against that. But I think a lot of the, political mainstream Muslim organizations have operated in a way to suggest that a certain type of treatment is okay.
The Justice for Muslims Collective is holding an event this evening at 5 at the True Reformer Building, 1200 U Street Northwest, beginning at 5. And so we invite you to join with them. You're listening to Dr. Maha Hilal, who is the co-director, along with Darashan Raja, who is the other co-director. And Justice for Muslims Collective was founded in 2016 and is trying to do work which really is to elevate the whole issues and struggles of the Muslim community, particularly in regards to the United States, but also the world, and also remind us as people who are not Muslim that in a sense we remain out of sync with the world and with the dynamic and diversity of the world. I wanted to thank. Do we have another call on the line? We want to go to this call and hear your perspective. Good morning. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. Thank you for being here.
No problem. I just had a question for Dr. Milal. Can you hear me?
Yes. Dr. Hilal, you can hear?
Yeah, I can, yeah.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay. I'm not trying to entrap or anything. You mentioned you were unhappy about the lack of analysis for the root causes for violence, both on the state level. But I was wondering if you would fault Americans who want to find root causes for Muslim attacks and discover Surah 5 and Surah 9 in the Quran, as well as the doctrine of abrogation and all that stuff. And I was just curious about your take on that.
Which verses?
Surah 5, Surah 9, the later verses from the Medina period, sorry, not the verses, but the surahs that were written toward the end of Muhammad's life.
So I'm not really versed in this. What exactly?
Yeah, what are you getting at?
In the surahs that I should comment on.
Okay. Well, just the later surahs that were written toward the end of Muhammad's life were more violent because he had become more politically powerful and more confident, and I was just curious, as people try to look into the causes for these terrorist attacks, and they see that, the Surah 9 was the last one that Muhammad.
Yeah, but that's an excuse. That's an excuse, and the reason I tell you that's an excuse is because you've had Christian evangelicalism in the United States carrying out an aggressive will all around the world, giving religious cover to the United States. In fact, in contemporary right now, you had people going to Afghanistan and Iraq with Christian scripture written on their rifles, engraved on their rifles, and crosses in their telescopes. And so the thing is that there's always a violent component that exists to any faith, particularly if it's taken and when it's taken out of context. And also, it is important that we recognize that the scriptures emerge not for all time, but out of a particular time. And I would say that for Christian scripture particularly, but I would dare to say that for other scriptures as well. And the language of that time exists, and the issue is that people don't draw warfare out of scripture, particularly people who legitimately try to find out what the divine have for them. They try to find peace through the scriptures. And that's where most of the people are. When I see people when I'm in Palestine and I see people going to the masjid to pray and those types of things, they're seeking out peace. They're seeking out meaning. I don't know if I've defined that any better than you probably can, Dr. Maha.
No, I think that absolutely is correct. I think that, Islam does have a concept of, very strong concept of justice and self-defense. And
right.
So I think that people often think that the self-defense is sort of a proactive kind of violence, which, my understanding is really that that's not the case. And I also think that, when we're looking at the geopolitical context right now, you can understand the root causes actually without religion, right? Religion is sometimes used in the calculation, but if we remove religion from the equation, we're talking about people that are under occupation, people that are, being oppressed in the form of detention, people that have no freedom of movement. So, I think that it actually becomes a lot less relevant because the political context is overwhelming. And with that said, can I just say one more thing?
Go ahead. Yes, please.
Because I think that there's this construction of Muslims as being irrational. And the reason that that's important is because there's always this perception that somehow Muslims are reacting in a way that's so abnormal, when in reality what's happening to Muslims is much different. So when, white supremacists talk about persecution, they're not actually being persecuted. When Muslims talk about it, we're talking about a death toll of more than 1 million people abroad, right? We're talking about numerous policies and laws that have been implemented domestically impacting the Muslim community.
Yes.
So again, it's this very specific construction that is driving the conversation on what are the root causes, right? And I think that's very important to
We're going to need to wrap up, Dr. Maha Hilal. Your event tonight is at 5 at the True Reformer Building at 1200 U Street Northwest. Please join Dr. Maha Hilal and also the Justice for Muslims Collective. Thank you for being on with us this morning, Dr. Hilal.
Thank you so much, Reverend.
As we prepare to sign off, you're listening to WPFW 89.3. This is What's at Stake. I'm Reverend Graylin Scott Hagler. Our executive producer is Verna Avery Brown, and Chris is our engineer in the studio. And as I prepare to sign off on this September the 11th, yes, we're mindful of those who have died and those who have been impacted in the World Trade Center and also in Shanksville, as well as the Pentagon. We are mindful of them, but we're also mindful of all of the people all around the world that has been killed through American aggression and through corporate greed, that has created a world where people are disenfranchised, where the have more and the have-nots have less. And so we need to come together and understand that what has happened and what continues to transpire in this world is a dynamic of inequality, that you have people who are poor struggling to be free and holding on to their faith in order to give them encouragement and strength. And so I sign off this morning with a little perspective on the subject. That's not the perspective you're going to hear on the airwaves, but truly this is a perspective I believe characterizes WPFW 89.3 FM. Take care. See you next time.